I'm back. Everybody back? There we go. All right. Where was I? I was talking about... Yeah, thanks, Mark. Just restart Twitch. Close the browser window and reopen it, Sephiroth. That's what I had to do. Sure. Actually, a great question you asked that. No, there is no skill tree per se. And what I mean by that is you can build a skill out of nothing, or you can be trained in the skill, or you can literally read up on it. And so what I mean by that is, now, when I say that, it's up to the storyteller, the game master, to determine whether or not the skill you have might be useful in another way. So, for example, I may have a locksmithing skill, and so I want to use that skill. I want to justify building a new skill for, I don't know, leveraging doors or something. I don't know. Anyway, that secondary skill can be, from the game master's perspective, allowed, and then that becomes a new skill, and it takes on the value of the old skill as well. So you can branch out your skills. So it's not a skill tree that says you must know this to know that. That's one of the biggest drawbacks I've seen to role-playing games, that in other words, in order to use a greatsword, I must be a fighter. And not only that, if I'm a fighter, I must also take the skill Great Cleave. And then if I have to get Great Cleave, I have to have Cleave. And if I have Cleave, then I have to have blah blah. And that structure, yes, thank you. It is an organically generated skill tree, and it's subject to each game master's perspective on it. Now, it is understood that any character that brings in a specific skill, that they have that skill. It is understood that the players are ethical enough that the character they're bringing in has the actual skills and has worked its way to get those skills. Mainly because if we can't trust each other to play a game, then what's the point? So when it comes to bringing a character into a story, literally any character can be used in any story with some caveats. So, for example, I run games in the NycosRPG mechanism that are in 6 different genres. As a matter of fact, in the short future, we will have 6 different guidebooks called system books. Dark Shards being the fantasy one, and other names for the others. So, yes, based on the GM's discretion and his mechanism for how he plays. And, of course, this is always open to discussion and conversation, because what is a role-play game if it isn't communication? So if you came to me with a character with an attribute or a skill, and you said, I want to be able to use this skill in the game, is that possible? I'm going to say yes. Generally, you're going to have to, as a player, come up with points in the game where you would need to use it for the dice roll to even be applicable. So why not? So now that does beg the question, how do you get skills? So when you've created the character's numbers, and you've got all 6 of the base foundations and the actual foundation value, which is the average, the number of skills you begin with in the game is equal to your foundation base, that number that you've created. So if you have 30s and 40s, then you come up with, say, a 37 on your foundation. That 37 foundation means you have 37 different skills of any sort that you can take at the beginning of the game. And you pick them. Now, there are some things that come from character development we haven't talked about yet. The culture that you come from gives you a few extra skills. Your species gives you some genetic marks, they're called, and the marks give you additional advanceable numbers that are like skills. And your estates, the economic position you are in your culture, gives you another set of skills. But after all of those, you still get an additional equal to your foundation base. So with that 42 skills, That's a really broad spectrum. That cooking, preparing meat, jousting, playing a musical instrument, speaking a language, writing a language. These are all things that skills can be. And so, in order to deconfuse that, within the Nycos RPG, you have the characteristic of the ways. So, going back through the creation, you have your base, race, place, estates, and ways. And the ways are the closest we come to analoging to a class. And this is referring to the types of careers you might follow within the Nycos framework. So you have the way of deeds, and that's the strongest, fastest. Gaston is a character who worries about deeds. You know, how much can you lift? How much can you push? How well are you a fighter? That kind of thing. So, way of deeds. Then there's the way of roads. The way of roads is about travel and nature and navigating and astronomy and all kinds of things that are dealing with the woodlands and outside with the idea of travel. Then you have the way of makers, and this is everything that is crafting based. So you can build a character who's got a lot of crafting skills. Maybe you start off being able to build a bow and make your own arrows and maybe forge a sword. These are all skills that you could develop as a way of makers. Then there's another skills list called the way of intrigues. And you'll find this juxtaposition quite interesting. The way of intrigues is not only the basis for a roguelike, a thief-based mechanism, but it is also for clergy. Because the way of intrigues is about secrets, about special knowledge, it's about codes and encryption, it's about knowing things that are unknowable, that kind of thing. Then you've got the way of words. And the way of words is equating to the concept of a bard or a minstrel or a wizard, the idea that you're going to write things down and that the words mean things. All of these could be, yeah, exactly. And so you're getting it, Mark. That's exactly right. You can cover all of those kind of things under the way of the intrigues. But the way of words then is actually maybe a journalist, maybe a chronicler, maybe a character like in Dungeons and Dragons lore like Volo, who goes and catalogs and describes things that he's discovered. These are all things that would be covered under the way of words. And then the way of wonders. And the way of wonders is the access to the nature of magic in Nycos. And mechanically, Nycos, the fantasy world that I write for, the one that I created, has a specific mechanism that allows magic to work. But the concepts behind the Dark Shards mechanisms that you find in the book are not only tied to that, but also tied to other cultural things. So examples of methodologies under the way of wonders. You get perhaps skills in runes and rune lore, maybe in metallurgy, maybe in stonemasonry and geology, maybe in alchemy and mystic associations, and maybe in the lore of actually within that you might have a person who has skills in foreign languages so that he can do mystical effects based on the sounds and the intonations. And also there are pantheons. In other words, there's entire schools of mystical thought, and they're not treated as religious pantheons, but they are cultural pantheons. So you have the pantheon of Falan, which is the elementals as fire, earth, air, water, and magicals themselves. And I use magicals with an LES on the end because they're particles. But anyway, so the Falan order are elementalists, and they pursue Fuerga, which is fire, Amba, which is earth, Limbra, which is magic, Ava, which is air, and Nava, which is water. So Falan is the overall mysticism dealing with elemental magics. then there's a separate one for the veils, and that has to do with philosophic and psychological magics, and they are many and varied. There are 9 colors of veils, or 10 colors of veils. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, purple, white, and black, and gray. So there's 10 in total. And so the orders of the veils use their colors and the magic that's associated with them to do different things. Of course, then there's additionally mentalists that are using their psychic power and so on. And the game allows for all of this and has mechanisms for each one separate from the others, and yet collectively, magical effects are all treated collectively. So regardless of how you get to it, the game master can give you abilities and capacities to improve or advance them over time. So you're not limited to any one of them. So now we've covered the ways. So now at this point, you've developed everything that you need to know about your character to deal with checks and conflicts. The next thing is a contest. And a contest is when you are comparing a skill in something with someone who has a skill in the opposite. So, for example, you're running from a bounty hunter. Bounty hunter has a skill in tracking. You have a skill in evasion. So you're going to be rolling against your evasion skill, and he's going to be rolling against his tracking skill. And each time you roll is going to represent a certain bracket of time that the GM defines beforehand. So if you got a half an hour head start, it's in that first half hour, for example. So if you are rolling against your attribute and you roll a partial success, it's still a success, so you haven't been caught. But your opponent has caught up with you, and therefore his level of success is going to determine how much he's caught up with you. So if he gets a wild success, he's basically trimmed your half an hour lead down to 5 minutes. And therefore now we're dealing with a 5-minute engagement for the next round, and you're going to roll again. And each time, it absolutely depends on a success or a failure. As long as you both succeed, the only thing he can do is get closer, or that you can get further away. The tracking of the racing only ends when one of you ceases or one of you fails. So if you've been running, of course, you're going to get more you're going to get tired. There's going to be fatigue that's setting in, and that all comes into it as well. And fatigue is how you basically resolve damage. I'll get more into that when we get to the combat side. But the idea is that when you're rolling, you have to realize that each round of action that you succeed, you're burning up your energy. You're getting more fatigued. So then you're still rolling and you're still checking. So on the third time, let's say you roll a success and I as the tracker roll a fail. Well, guess what? Pretty obvious, right? You succeeded. I didn't succeed, therefore you got away. Now I can switch skills and now say I'm going to be hunting for your tracks, but that's a completely different thing. It's got nothing to do with you. You have made your escape. In reverse, the same is true. If you get a partial success, if you get a success of any sort, you're still running, even if the opponent gets a perfect success. He goes to exactly where he thought you would be, and if you got a partial success, you got away. But if you fail, any failure is a complete failure. You're caught. It's done. Now, what happens with that is a graduated thing, and we'll talk about that when we get actually to the damage part of that. But just realize that a contest is you competing with an opponent who's using a skill that is the opposite of yours. So if you were playing in a cyberpunk adventure or shadowpunk, what do you call it? Then you're rolling to hack into a system, and the opponent is rolling for the black eyes. And as long as you succeed, even if he succeeds, he's not disabling you. This therefore gives you the opportunity to eventually overcome him. So that's those three: checks, conflicts, contests. The last is combat. And combat is a bit more nuanced. And that is that each round of combat is going to be determined to be a period of time that other people could be doing other actions. So if you are in a fight, but one of your player members is picking a lock, then the lock picker has a chance to make that die roll at the same time the two of you are rolling your combat conflict. And the combat die rolls are still success fail, but you get to choose options. So let's say you've taken a skill in sword fighting and you've been sword fighting for several sessions, and so your sword fighting skill is now up to 40. If you look at that, you realize that a partial success is almost 80%. So it's very rarely that you're not going to get a touch on the opponent, so to speak. You're able to put some pressure on him. So instead, you want to branch out and have a specific skill in disarming. Disarming skill is not going to be at the full amount, but neither is it a full drop-off, because it's a skill that derived from your already fighting skill. So that skill is going to start over at your core value, your base value for that skill. So if it was grace, then it gets to start at 35%, but your actual sword fighting skill is 40. So if you're just competently fighting, you're going to be doing more damage on an average than you are if you're trying to disarm, because that disarm chance is reduced. But each time you use it, it's going to get better, so that you can actually build up specific skills, and the specific skills almost become like your collection of golf clubs. So in a combat scene, you're going to look through your combat skills and say, oh, I want to use this skill, or oh, he's using a flail, so I want to utilize my armor protection skill. So I'm going to depend on my armor more than I am on my physical skill, because the armor is going to be able to ablate the damage or whatever. But that graduation of skills is a matter of what you choose to advance in. And if you do nothing but advance in just your sword fighting, you'll be great as long as you are specifically sword fighting. But if you go up a sword against a gun, it doesn't do you any good. Whereas if you took a skill in evasion, perhaps you might be able to use some of that skill to avoid. So just realize that the infinite number of potential skills only gives also an infinite number of alternative skills that the opponent could have to counteract. So, well, I didn't even get halfway through my list here, and we're already way past my start time. But that's okay, as long as you're willing to keep on talking. I'm glad to keep chatting. So go ahead and put a hi in the a hello or a hi in the chat, so I know you're still here, and I'll keep going. Otherwise, I will go back to my scheduled rants and such, and go through all of those. So yeah, that's what happens. Okay, so here's a news flash for you. I discovered probably 10 years ago the secret to eternal youth. And I don't talk about it every place, but exactly. I'm sorry your chair is falling apart. I got one that's breaking on me. It's I've had it for 6 years, and it's taken so much abuse. Still holding on for now, so I'll probably wait till my birthday or whatever. But the secret of the Fountain of Youth, the secret to eternal youth, is to stay in play. You may remember this when you were a kid. I definitely remember when I was a kid that when you went outside and you were with your friends, you could start at 10 o'clock in the morning, and it could be 6 o'clock at night, and the lights are coming on, and your mom shouts for you, and you're like, we just got started. Time does not exist in the place of play. When your brain is engaged in the creativity and the innovation that is playfulness, you do not age. You're not getting any older. I mean, physically, I'm getting older. I don't know if I look it, but this year I'll be 60. And my son declared himself older than me when he turned 18, because he joined the Marine Corps, and I think that he was right, and so I am fundamentally perpetually 17, although arguably I do look a little bit older than 17. The gray hairs kind of give that away. But as far as whether or not I look 60, I know that my grandfather, when he was 60, I thought he was old, and he lived till he was almost 90, so it's not old by any stretch. But the secret is that just as we've been in the zone in this conversation and carrying on, and whatever, it's we are lost in the space time continuum, because for us the time is not passing, we are experiencing it, we are in it right then. So yeah, if you wanted to know how to remain eternally youthful, continue playing games. Okay, so great question. What about armor? Traditional role-play games, such as Dungeons and Dragons, have armor as a target that has to be overcome. Now, this is kind of silly from the standpoint of, I don't care how hard I hit you with a hammer. A hammer is not going to do more damage than an axe in terms of going through armor. It's going to be a toss-up. So in the NycosRPG system, armor is instead treated as a damage ablation. It costs some fatigue to wear armor, but that fatigue is negated by its benefits. So therefore, when you are in a fight scene and a person successfully makes an attack and you fail, they can choose to deal damage, and that is an option. And this is also true in actual fighting. You do not necessarily have to harm your opponent, but you do get to place a condition on them. So, for example, if I am swinging at you with my overhead hammer attack, and I succeed and you fail, my hammer is coming down, and so maybe I use it to knock your shield aside. That is a condition. You are without your shield. Or I cause you to be knocked off balance. Therefore, your off balance is a condition. So the graduated scale between partial, full, and wild success gives you 1, 2, or 3 conditions to place on the opponent based on how well you did compared to their failure. If you both fail, the fight's not over and it continues, but you both get some rest. And so you'll recover some of your fatigue loss from the fight. But generally speaking, 2 fails is not the end of the battle. But 1 success and 1 failure is. And what that successful end of the battle does is evoke a condition. And the GM allows the player to determine which condition they would like to do. And in certain cases, we'll put a limit to it. Or in other cases, just say, what condition do you want to put? And therefore, the player gets to pick. So, for example, if a warrior is chasing down a goblin and you succeed in defeating the goblin, yes. So fatigue replaces hit points only because hit points cease to exist at all. So fatigue is the only number you have to worry about. And fatigue is also a percentage-based mechanism. So at the beginning of every fight, you're at 100% of fatigue, and each damage that is dealt reduces your fatigue by a number. But the amount of damage that weapon will do is abrogated by the type of armor. So if you are wearing an armor that is resistant to that type of attack, it prevents the loss of fatigue altogether. So if I'm wearing a suit of plate armor and all you have is a pocket knife, you're going to get to do, you succeeded in beating me in that round, but what are you going to do with a pocket knife? Okay, so therefore you attempt to stab me and I use my armor to ablate it. So that ablation is 100% coverage. You don't actually take any damage, but the armor can have different levels of that. So yes, but armor's fatigue is a set value at the beginning and doesn't change. Even if you fought for an hour, your fatigue number is going to be the same. It doesn't take away. It only takes into account if you're loading on beyond that, or you are now, injured or whatever. So armor's fatigue loss is a set figure that's already, if you will, negated. So let me give a better explanation. So I go and put a suit of armor on. That suit of armor is going to encumber me compared to my physical movement. But if I've taken a skill in armor use, then I get rid of that fatigue loss because I know how to use my armor. I figured out how to walk so that it doesn't hurt me, I don't get chafing, and I'm able to move normally. Granted, armor use becomes a skill, and obviously you'd have to develop a die roll for that. But again, with the up-down, you only have to worry about that at the beginning of the fight. So if you have successfully made your armor use check, the fight will not affect your armor fatigue at all, or the armor will not affect your fatigue at all during the fight. So another great question: does fatigue replace hit points? No, I'm actually I'm wanting the concept of hit points to be seen for what it is. In the 1960s, I know it sounds like I'm going way back, but in the 1960s, American wargaming had developed a realization that we won World War II not by being better fighters, but by depriving the opponent of warfighting capability. And so therefore the game's models that were being used in wargamings did include a numeric value. In many cases it was the logistics value, or it was the production value, or whatever. Well, when Dungeons and Dragons was evolved out of chainmail, it did a similar thing. It said that a person has a pool of hit points. It's not realistic by any stretch. You and I could arm wrestle or whatever for an extended period of time, and neither one of us would die, no matter how much we arm wrestled, because that action doesn't cause death. So, therefore, yes. So armor is a skill. And once you have the armor skill in that armor type, that armor's ablation effects go into effect, and you no longer suffer the fatigue. If you don't have the armor's skill, it still provides you the ablation effects, but it does cause fatigue. Does that make sense? It's only when you don't know how to wear the armor and you're not comfortable with it that it causes problems. So once you have, therefore, your armor and your gear and you're in the fight, you have to think about your life essence not as a pool or a bundle, but instead think of it as a barometer. In other words, it has a numeric value between 0, which means you're unconscious and unable to move, all the way to 95%, which is fully functional and everything can go right. Each time you lose fatigue, that top end is taken down. So the amount of energy you can recover is dropped. So, yes, exactly, Mark, you got it. Certain types of armor work better against certain types of attacks. And injuries can be sustained. And the difference between an injury and other things is that an injury is a form of a condition. So you can say, I'm hitting the guy and I am wounding him. And that is your condition. So therefore he takes physical damage. And therefore that physical injuries go against another kind of amorphous value, which is health. And it literally isn't anything other than your foundation. And those injuries are a constant cause of fatigue until they're healed. So the book has, the NycosRPG Dark Shards book has everything about this. So injuries are debilitating effects that can reduce your overall functionality, and you can actually take a skill in dealing with them. The idea of working while you're hurt. You can say walking wounded and have that as a skill where you're not losing fatigue from being injured because you know how to keep your arm against your body, you know how to protect it or whatever. So there are, again, skills that can overcome the need for saves. Now there's more in it than this. We could go into infection. There's the possibility that an injury is not taken care of. You don't treat it. Instead, you just walk in a daze off the battlefield and you can't fix it yourself. So you can become infected, and infection can lead to death in game. But it also gives all kinds of other possibilities. So we could rabbit hole and be here for days. So I'm now coming up on hour number 2. So we've got I know it's only 32. I got half an hour yet. I'm fine. So if you are wearing, for example, chainmail armor, it's going to be better against a I think it's better against a slashing attack than it is against a bludgeoning attack, because the bludgeoning attack still moves the chain out of the way. So moves the chain with it. So it transfers the power, but it doesn't do the damage, so to speak. Whereas piercing could theoretically go through the chain. the table, I've got the table's available in the book. I haven't memorized yet, and I don't always use it. So therefore, the idea of sustaining an injury has to be a very real consideration when you're involved with combat. If your opponent is only trying to win the battle, wanting to get you to change your mind, he may not be trying to kill you. He may not be actually doing harm to you. But on the other hand, if he's got a death wish, or he's a monster and doesn't really care, perhaps he is going to actually cause injuries and cause debilitation and death. So these are all nuanced into it and are again left to the game master to determine the level of intensity of the scene. So with the fact that the conflict ends when there is a success and the other person fails, it means therefore that fight scenes don't go to the death very often. Normally somebody's going to foil a roll before somebody is dead, and this is in keeping also with an idea that we all have kind of come to understand when it comes to motion pictures and books and such, and that is that the actual reality of persona death, character death, is almost non-existent. When I think of Lord of the Rings, who can you think of who actually died in the Lord of the Rings story, other than Boromir and the Steward of Gondor and Faramir? Not Faramir. No, I can't remember. Anyway, there's so few deaths in the system that when we are role playing, we don't anticipate to watch somebody lose their life, and so therefore, playing with an idea that the fights can end without death makes it more cinematic, more realistic, and it also causes another mechanism that I think is really useful in role-playing games, and that is it shows a sense of realism that isn't found in the classics, Dungeons and Dragons and others like it, because in those games, absolute death is a requirement. That is what you are doing, is you are killing the monsters, and defeating or driving off a monster should be a more rational and more possible option, but role-play games as they are designed don't offer that. And so by having a mechanism that allows for the fight to maybe last 2 rounds, maybe 3 rounds, is far more palatable than the combat slog, or what I call the bam bam of Dungeons and Dragons. I roll to hit you, I miss, your roll. You roll to hit me, you miss, my turn. I roll to hit you. You know, that kind of back and forth is not A, historically realistic, and B, representative of a dynamic combat scene. So the game masters either has to narratively be flamboyant and express things beyond what's actually seen in the die rolls, whereas in a NycosRPG with the graduated die rolling mechanism, you can see how close somebody got. Oh, they narrowly missed nicking an artery, or they, you know. So therefore, there's ways to show that graduated difference in each comparison of a die roll. Next question that you haven't asked, but is a great question, is what about fighting against multiple people targeting a single foe? In which case, the single foe only has to win against all characters. So if you are fighting a monster and the monster is backed into a corner, the monster has to defeat everybody. Now, theoretically, that could happen if you all fail and he makes a success. But if he succeeds in the fight and you fail, even if you've got multiple opponents against him, you are out of action, which means the wound that you took, the damage that he did to you, that he inflicted, has put you out of the combat sequence. Therefore, it's down to whoever's left. Now, at any point where they succeed at a greater level than he does, then they can, as an action, bring in another player. So you can actually jump back into a fight, but only when the opportunities are afforded you by the opponents that are still fighting. This mechanism allows for more of a fluid and cinematic way of looking at the fight scenes and links it all together. And Well, okay, so yes and no. Good question. Injuries sound subjective in terms of whether or not you successfully hit. The damage, however, is not arbitrary. It's based on the weapon type, and therefore it is a fixed number instead of a variable number. Now, it doesn't mean you can't have a skill to allow you to do more damage, but generally speaking, it won't. It is going to be a knife will do, a knife or small weapon will do 1 point of damage. A sword or other medium weapon will do 2 damage, and a couched lance or a placed spear will do 3 damage. Once those are determined, then the damage is mitigated or ablated by the armor, and then the damage is applied. In any case, the fatigue that comes from the fight for that round still applies, and the amount of fatigue is equal to 1 plus the level of success the opponent had over you. So if you have a partial success and the opponent has a wild success, that is 2 steps above. So you would take 10 percentage points of fatigue from that, plus the 5 for being in the fight. If you fail, then you take all of the difference between the two as fatigue damage on top of the actual damage. So the subjective nature of damage is intentionally set at a low value so that it is not a matter of eliminating your opponent by damage, because it's not realistic. I'm sorry. The idea that I have a two-handed axe, and the two-handed axe, because of the fact that I have been doing it for a long time, makes me cleave more damage into the opponent, is not realistic. It is not showing anything. Perhaps it's showing a better positioning, but the hit points don't translate that way. Hit points are instead a big pool, and so it shouldn't make more damage. This case, since the damage is subjective, it's just a factor that's going to influence fatigue. Now, again, this is for this is leading into the concept that Nykos, as a role-playing game, doesn't necessarily deal with the pure physics of damage. What does, however, is the types of damage are defined by the weapon and the type, and even if there is magic involved. So a point of damage of fire damage goes against armor differently than the point of damage of puncturing damage. So therefore, the armor ablation is going to be based on the armor and its propensities against different types of damage. And so there's a grid chart that shows that. So, well. So does that make sense so far, Mark? Or am I keeping you on the edge of your seat, or am I confusing you further? I do want to thank you for being viewers tonight and participation in the chat. It really helps. That's a fair answer, Mark. For more information about all of this, you can go to my Patreon account, patreon.com/Nykos, NYCOS, like the name appears. Or you can go to NycosRPG.com, which is the website. Yeah, you definitely might want to read through the rules. Those are available in the NycosRPG manual, which is available as a PDF from NycosRPG.com. Just click on the shop, and then you can purchase the PDF. It's the early version. I have not yet added any artwork to it. It's just the sheer rules of the game. I do have a paperback version that is available through lulu.com. So if you go to lulu.com and you put in my name, Jonathan Albin, you can find my author page and be able to pick the book up there. I believe that's around $20 or so, $25 for the paperback. And I've seen it. I've got copies. I've got them actually here in the house someplace. But definitely want to read those. I will also be doing further presentations on this stuff coming up in the future. So, for example, tomorrow is Monday. I have a games group in Redlands, California. Oh, today is Sunday, right? Yeah, it's already Monday. So I'm going to be in Redlands, California. So if you're in the Southern California area and you wanted to participate, you're more than welcome to come down to Board Game Paradise in Redlands, California, on State Street, and join me 6 o'clock p.m. till 10 p.m. Let's see if I can find it covered. Just a second. I'll show you. This might be hard to show based on the way the video works, but and it's about 108, 110 pages. So that's what the book looks like. There you go. A little blurry. Yeah, so. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's old like me. I've been working on developing the NycosRPG for about 5 or 6 years. I've considered, as a matter of fact, if you are familiar with the, well, you are familiar with the Wizard of the Coast process, back when they were looking for Eberron, they didn't know what they were looking for, but they asked game masters to submit story worlds for consideration, and I sent Nykos in at that point and was defeated, and so for that reason I personally despise the Eberron setting, but that's just the pettiness on my part. So anyway, this video did not meet with the visual description of what I was going to do today, so this will probably reside in Twitch rather than moving over to YouTube. Although it was a really great conversation, I may send it over to the maybe I can send it to the podcast, because it's still verbally astute. It just doesn't catch the points that I intended. So, oh well, it does sort of. We covered all of the different topics in it. We just didn't go specifics on them all. So. Ah! What kind of roll did I make when I was defeated? I didn't even get to roll. That's the issue there, is that also it applies in the NycosRPG. Certain conditions make it so that you can't be involved in the fight. So in other words, if you claim that you're going to engage with an opponent and there's no opponent within range, if you move towards the enemy and do not come into range with them, then you're not in the combat. So you can't roll to hit, and neither can they hit you because you are not involved. If, on the other hand, you are an archer and you choose to stay out of the conflict, even as you shoot arrows into the combat, you are not in the combat technically, because the archery is a feature that happens outside of combat. So you have to think about it for a minute, but that's the whole point is that the only portions of combat that require die rolling is when you are directly engaged with an opponent who is seeking to do you harm, or to invoke a condition on you. So, for example, if a officer of the law is trying to grab you for causing and disturbing the peace in town, that is a combat action because he's attempting to grab you and detain you. That begins a combat conflict. So, therefore, you now have to resolve how you handle that. You could quit and surrender and let him grab you, or you could fight him back. So, it should make sense for it to be in those contexts only. So anyway, I want to thank you guys so much for hanging out for this long. I will definitely be back tomorrow at 11 o'clock. That's when we start every night, 11 o'clock p.m. Pacific time. I want to thank you, Mark and Sephiroth, for being such great sports and conversing with me throughout. And I hope to see you again in a new episode. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to the channel and click the like button so that the episode gets its due to the audience, so they know that we're here, and to help me expand it. If you like the participation and you want to involve others, make sure you share it with others. Let them know what we're talking about. And if you give them this video and have them listen to it all, they'll have a much better understanding of what the NycosRPG system is about, and you might be able to consider using it in the future. So thank you so much for being here, and I will be back here again tomorrow. Have a great night, and I will see you again. Make sure you do also check out NycosRPG.com and get yourself a character sheet. Also starting games, start playing .games, so you can sign up for the How to Play event on Saturday morning, 10 o'clock Pacific time. All right, I will talk to you guys later. Have a great night. Come on, button.